A boot slammed into the side of a motorcycle. The bike rocked on its stand, metal groaning, and nearly went over. A wrench hit the concrete floor and skidded under a workbench. A big man turned away, both hands shaking, and drove his fist into a steel locker. The whole clubhouse went quiet. Grown men, road-hardened, all of them staring at a rusted heap of an engine that would not start. 3 summers of trying. 3 summers of nothing. Denny Callahan wiped grease off his face and said the words nobody wanted to hear. He said the old machine was dead and it was time to let it go. But in the doorway, unseen, an 8-year-old boy stood watching, holding a wrench of his own. His name was Micah. What that little boy did before sundown made every single one of those bikers weep. Stay with me on this one. The town was called Colville, tucked in a fold of the West Virginia hills where the road still curved the way the river told them to. The Iron Wardens had a clubhouse at the edge of it, a low cinderblock building with a gravel lot, and a garage bay that smelled of oil and old leather. 20-odd men rode with them. Every one of them was hard in the way men get hard when the mine's close, and the work dries up, and they learn to lean on each other because there's nothing else left to lean on. Denny Callahan was their road captain. Everybody called him Rope, on account of a story nobody told the same way twice. He was 61 years old with forearms like knotted cable and a beard gone the color of ash. He'd buried 2 brothers and a wife, and he did not cry, not at any of the funerals, not once. Men respected him for it. They also feared him a little, which is a thing that happens to men who never let you see them bleed. In the corner of that garage sat the Panhead, a 1948 Harley-Davidson, the kind of machine they don't build anymore and couldn't build again if they tried. It had belonged to Earl Stroud, the man who started the Iron Wardens back when Denny was a kid with skinned knuckles and no daddy to speak of. Everybody called Earl the Deacon, because he could quote scripture and cuss in the same breath and somehow make both sound holy. He built that motorcycle with his own 2 hands, rebuilt it a dozen times, and rode it for 40 years. Understand something about that bike. In Colville, it was famous. Folks who never rode a day in their life knew the sound of it. Mothers used to tell their kids that when they heard that thunder come rolling down the ridge at dusk, it meant Earl was carrying somebody's medicine over the mountain, or a bag of groceries to a widow, or just himself home. The deacon never let that machine sit idle when a body in town was in need. So the bike wasn't a bike. It was 40 years of a man doing right by people, wrapped in steel and chrome. Then Earl got sick, the kind of sick that doesn't turn around. He faded through one winter and was gone by spring, and he took something out of the club when he went. The Panhead had sat in the garage ever since, and it had not run in 3 years. Not once. Now here's the thing you have to understand. These men had tried. Lord, how they had tried. They pulled the engine apart and put it back together. They replaced the points, the plugs, the coil. They bought a new carburetor from a fellow in Ohio who swore it was correct for the year. They drained the tank, cleaned the lines, honed the cylinders. Buck, who used to turn wrenches at the Ford dealership before it shut down, spent a whole July on it. He'd come in at first light and leave after dark, sweating through his shirt, talking to that engine like it was a stubborn mule. He tore the top end down twice in a single month and put it back together perfect, and it still wouldn't run. And by August he threw a socket clear across the bay and walked out swearing he'd never touch the thing again. They kicked that starter until their knees gave out. The engine would cough, it would spit. Sometimes it would fire once, a single hard bang like a gunshot, and then die and go silent, and no amount of pleading would bring it back. Every summer they promised Earl's memory they'd have it running by the anniversary of his death. Every summer they failed, and a thing like that eats at men. It sat in the corner like a rebuke, like the old man was watching and shaking his head. So on that particular afternoon, when Denny kicked it and hurt his own foot and slammed his fist into the locker, What he was really doing was giving up. He said it out loud. He said, "It's a dead motor, boys. We've done everything a man can do. Time to stop torturing ourselves." Nobody argued. That was the worst part. Nobody argued. Which brings us to the boy. Micah Stroud was Earl's grandson. 8 years old, small for it, quiet in a way that made grown-ups uneasy because they didn't know what he was thinking. His mother worked 2 jobs over in the next county, and his daddy wasn't in the picture. And so most afternoons Micah walked to the clubhouse after school because it was the one place in the world that still felt like his grandfather. The men let him hang around. They gave him soda and told him rough jokes and mostly forgot he was there. He never made noise. He'd sit on an overturned bucket by the Panhead with a 3-legged shop dog named Diesel pressed against his knee, and he'd watch. Diesel had been Earl's dog, lost a leg under a truck years back and just kept going, the way some creatures do. After Earl died, that dog wouldn't go to anybody. Then Micah started coming around and Diesel decided the boy was his, and that was the end of the discussion. Where Micah went, the dog went, hobbling along on 3 legs and never complaining. And there was one more thing Micah always had with him: a notebook. Grease-stained, swollen with damp, the cover held together with black tape. It had been his grandfather's. Earl wrote everything in it for 40 years. Every fix, every setting, every stubborn secret that old machine ever gave up. When Earl died, that notebook went to Micah, and the boy carried it everywhere like other kids carry a blanket. He couldn't yet read every word of it. But he'd trace his grandfather's handwriting with one finger, slow, the way you'd touch a photograph, and some afternoons he'd fall asleep on the bucket with it open in his lap and Diesel keeping watch. Nobody had ever really read it. The men figured they knew more than some old scribbles could teach them. They were professionals. They'd rebuilt the whole engine twice. What was a notebook going to tell them that their own hands hadn't already learned? So that afternoon, when Denny called it dead, the men drifted off to drink and be angry and grieve the only way they knew how. And the boy sat down on his bucket by the cold engine, with the dog against his knee and the notebook in his lap, and he opened to the first page. And he started to read. What none of those men knew was that the answer they'd been chasing for 3 summers was written down in Earl Stroud's own hand, and it had been sitting 6 feet away the entire time. Nobody noticed the boy stay behind. Why would they? He was always there and always quiet, and the men had their own hurt to carry that evening. They cranked up a truck. Half of them rode into town, and the rest sat out on the porch passing a bottle and not saying much. The garage went dim and cool. Just the boy, the dog, the dead machine, and 40 years of a dead man's handwriting. Now, you and I both know a notebook can't fix an engine, but it can do something the men had stopped doing. It can make you slow down. And the first thing Micah read on the very first page in his grandfather's crooked block letters was this: "She don't like to be rushed. You crank her too hard, she'll flood and sulk on you for a week. Treat her gentle. Listen before you touch. Listen before you touch." Micah read that line 3 times. He couldn't have told you why, but he'd noticed something all those afternoons on the bucket. When the men kicked the starter, they kicked it angry. They twisted the throttle wide open and stomped down with all their weight and cussed when nothing happened. They were fighting the machine. And the notebook, page after page, kept saying the same thing in different words. Don't fight her. Feel for it. Half a turn of throttle, no more. Let her breathe. So the boy didn't touch anything for a long time. He just sat there and looked. He read the notebook by the light of a single work lamp, page by page, and every few minutes he'd look up at the engine like it was a person he was getting to know. Some of the words were too big for him and he'd sound them out under his breath, slow, the way his teacher taught him, and when he got stuck he'd hold the page up to the lamp as if the light might help. He wasn't in a hurry. That was the whole thing. He wasn't in a hurry, and not one of those grown men had been anything but in a hurry for 3 years. Somewhere around the middle of the notebook, he found a page with the corner folded down. His grandfather had folded it. On that page, Earl had drawn a little diagram of the timing gears, and beside it he'd written, "If she fires once and quits, don't go blaming the carb. 90 times out of 100, it's the key on the timing gear worked loose. Little half-moon of steel, size of your thumbnail. She'll shear it and jump time and act dead when she ain't. Pull the cover, look at the key. Everybody forgets the key." Micah didn't know what half of those words meant. But he knew what firing once and quitting sounded like, because he'd heard the engine do exactly that 100 times. That one hard bang, like a gunshot, and then nothing. He'd heard the men curse it, and here was his grandfather, dead 3 years, telling him what it meant. The boy set down the notebook. He went to the toolbox and found a wrench that fit, the way the notebook said, and he began, very slowly, to loosen the bolts on the cover his grandfather had drawn. He was 8. His hands were small. It took him the better part of an hour, resting when the bolts wouldn't move, breathing the way he'd watched his grandfather breathe. Twice the wrench slipped and skinned his knuckles, and twice he stopped and shook his hand out and went right back to it, and Diesel lay against his leg the whole time and never moved. And when the cover finally came free, Micah looked inside with the work lamp, and he found the little half-moon of steel. The woodruff key, just like the drawing, and it was sheared clean through, and the gear had slipped, exactly the way the notebook said it would. The boy sat back on his heels and looked at that broken piece of metal the size of his thumbnail, and he understood something that 3 summers of grown men had missed. The engine wasn't dead. It had been trying to tell them what was wrong the whole time, over and over, with that one hard bang, and nobody had been listening. His grandfather had known. His grandfather had left the answer folded down on a page, waiting for somebody patient enough to read it. By then it was full dark, and Micah's mother would be worried, so he closed the notebook and put the wrench down gentle and went home. He didn't tell the men what he'd found. Maybe he thought they wouldn't believe him. Maybe he wanted to be sure first. He walked home in the dark with the dog beside him, and for the first time in 3 years, that garage held something other than defeat. The next morning was a Saturday, and the mood at the clubhouse had settled into something quiet and final. The anger had burned off overnight. What was left was just grief, and a decision that had already been made. And that is where the story turned. Because Saturday morning, a stranger's truck pulled into the gravel lot. He was a heavy-set man in a clean pressed shirt, the kind who never had grease under his nails in his life. His name was Vernon Pike, and he was a collector out of Charleston, and he'd come with a checkbook and a flatbed trailer. Denny had called him 3 days before, in the low place after all that kicking and cursing, and made an arrangement he hadn't told the younger men about. Here's what Denny hadn't told them. The clubhouse was 2 months behind on the building loan. The bank had sent a letter with hard words in it, the kind of letter that uses the word foreclosure and means it. And a rusted, non-running 1948 Panhead, even dead, was worth real money to the right buyer, enough money to keep the roof over their heads through the winter. Vernon Pike wanted it for parts and restoration. He'd give them cash today, and he'd haul it away today, and the Iron Wardens would survive another season. Denny gathered the men and told them straight. He said Earl would rather see the club live than see his old bike rot in a corner mocking them. He said a dead machine can't be sentimental. He said they'd tried everything a man could try, and it was time to be practical, and the truck would load at sundown. You could see it hit them. This wasn't about pride anymore or about failing an old man's memory. This was the last piece of Earl Stroud leaving town on the back of a stranger's trailer, gone for good, and there was nothing sentimental they could do about it because they needed the money to eat. The grief had a deadline now. Sundown. And standing in the doorway, holding that taped-up notebook against his chest, The boy heard every word. Micah didn't cry and he didn't argue. He just turned and walked into the garage, and Diesel hobbled after him, and the men were too caught up in their own hard feelings to notice the boy had gone white as a sheet. He had until sundown. He had a broken key the size of his thumbnail, and a notebook, and 2 small hands, and he had until the light went down behind the hills. He thought about running to Denny and telling him what he'd found. But he'd tried telling grown men things before, and he knew the look they'd give him, that soft, sorry look people give a child who doesn't understand. Words wouldn't work. Only the sound would work. He'd have to make the bike speak for itself. He found the wrench again. He got the cover off faster this time because he knew the way now. And then he hit the first wall, because a boy can find a broken part, but a boy can't make a new one appear out of nothing. But the notebook had thought of that too. Micah turned to the folded page and read the rest, the part below the drawing, the part the men never got to because they never opened the book. Earl had written, "Keep spares in the coffee can on the 3rd shelf. Made a mess of keys myself over the years. If you're reading this and she's down, check the can before you cry about it." Micah climbed up on the workbench. On the 3rd shelf, back in the dust behind the cans of bolts, was an old coffee can. And inside it, wrapped in oilcloth, were a dozen little half-moons of steel his grandfather had cut and filed by hand, years ago, for exactly this day. The boy sat down on the concrete floor and held one of those keys in his palm and looked at it a long time. His grandfather had made these. His grandfather had known this exact thing would break someday, long after he was gone, and he'd left a can of the answer on the 3rd shelf and a note telling whoever loved the bike enough to look. Micah's chin trembled, but he wiped his face on his sleeve because he had work to do and the sun was already climbing, and Diesel put his head in the boy's lap like he understood. If you're still with me this far, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because what this 8-year-old did over the next few hours is the kind of thing you'll want to tell somebody about later. Setting that new key was the hard part. The gear had to line up just so. The notebook had a page on timing marks with arrows and a warning underlined twice. Line up the dots or she'll never run right. Take your time. Micah couldn't read a timing light and didn't have one anyway. But the notebook told him where the marks were stamped into the metal, 2 little punch dots, and it told him to turn the engine by hand until they kissed. So that's what the boy did. He turned it by hand, slow, watching those 2 dots creep toward each other, backing off when he went too far, for the better part of 2 hours, until they lined up perfect. Twice he thought he had it and didn't, and he made himself start over rather than force it, because the notebook said take your time and his grandfather had never once been wrong. Then he seated the key. His hands were shaking and it took him 4 tries, but he got it home, and he tightened the gear the way the notebook said, snug but not cruel, and he bolted the cover back down. And that was the deep problem solved, the one that had beaten Buck and Denny and every wrench in the club. But an old engine that sat 3 years has more than one thing wrong with it, and the boy wasn't done yet. The men had come by with fresh anger. The notebook came by with fresh answers. Water in the tank from 3 years of damp. The notebook, drain her low if she sits or you'll get water and rust in the bowl. Micah pulled the little drain and let the bad fuel run out into a pan until it ran clean and bright. Old plugs fouled black from all that flooding. Micah pulled them, wire brushed them the way the notebook drew it, set the gap with a feeler he found in the drawer. A choke the men had been yanking wrong. The notebook, she likes half choke cold, none hot. Don't drown her. All those little things, all of them written down. All of them ignored for 3 summers by men who thought they were too good to read. By late afternoon, the boy had gone through the whole notebook, cover to cover, and done every single thing his grandfather told him to do, in order, gentle, patient, listening the way the very first page said to listen. and the shadows in the garage were getting long. Out in the lot, they were getting ready to load. Vernon Pike backed his flatbed up to the garage bay, and the beep 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 of the reverse warning filled the yard. The men gathered, hands in their pockets, nobody able to look straight at the Panhead. Denny had the check folded in his shirt. The sun was maybe 40 minutes off the ridge, and a couple of the men rolled the garage door up all the way to make room for the ramp. That's when they saw him. Micah was standing beside the Panhead, small and greasy and dead serious, with the notebook in one hand and Diesel at his heel. He'd rolled it out of its corner into the middle of the bay, and he looked up at all those big men and he said, in that quiet voice of his, "Don't put it on the truck yet. Please. Let me try one thing." You should have seen their faces, half pity, half nothing. Buck started to say something kind and useless, the kind of thing you say to a child. Denny just shook his head slow and said, "Son, we've had a dozen grown men on that machine for 3 years. It's time." But the boy had already turned to the bike. And he did everything different from the way the men did it, and every one of them saw it, even if they didn't understand it yet. He didn't twist the throttle wide. He gave it a whisper, a crack, no more, the way the first page said. He set the choke to half. He didn't stomp. He put his whole small weight on the kickstarter and brought it down slow to find the compression, the way a man feels for a lock in the dark, and only then from the top did he bring it down clean. The engine turned, caught, coughed, and then it caught again, and this time it didn't die. It rumbled, it stumbled. Micah eased that whisper of throttle just so, coaxing, the way you'd calm a spooked animal, and the rumble steadied, and then, 3 years dead, that 1948 Panhead cleared its throat and roared. I mean, it roared. That deep, uneven, gut-shaking thunder that only an old Harley makes, the sound Earl Stroud made 1,000 times coming up that gravel road, the sound not one of those men had heard in 3 years and had made peace with never hearing again. It rolled out of the open bay and across the lot and off the hills, and it came back as an echo, like the whole valley was answering. Nobody moved. Vernon Pike stood frozen with his ramp half down. Buck's mouth hung open. And the boy stood there with both hands on his grandfather's motorcycle, feeling it shake and live under his palms, and he wasn't looking at the men. He was looking at the empty air over the tank, the way you look at somebody who just walked into the room. Denny Callahan walked toward that bike like a man in church. He put one hand on the warm engine as if to prove to himself it was real. He looked at the little boy. He looked at the sheared parts laid out clean on a rag, and the coffee can and the open notebook. And in a voice that had gone strange and rough he said, "How, son? How in God's name?" And that's when the boy told them. And that's when those hard men came apart. Micah didn't puff up. He didn't grin. He held out the notebook in his 2 greasy hands, open to that folded down page, and he said, "Grandpa already fixed it. He wrote it all down. I just did what he said." He told them about the key, the little half-moon of steel that shears and makes her act dead when she ain't. He told them about the coffee can on the 3rd shelf, the spares his grandfather cut by hand years ago and left waiting. He told them the first page said to listen before you touch, and he told them in that plain, small voice that he thought maybe they'd all been in too big a hurry. "You were mad at it," he said. "Grandpa said she don't like to be rushed." Denny took the notebook in his big scarred hands like it might break. He turned to that folded page and read the drawing and the words underneath in Earl's crooked block letters, the answer they'd been chasing for 3 summers, sitting 6 feet from where they cursed. And the big man's shoulders started to shake. But Micah wasn't finished. He said, "There's one more part. The last page. I only read it this morning." And he reached over and turned the notebook to the very back, to the final page, where Earl had written something that was not about engines at all. Denny read it out loud because his voice was the only one that could get through, and even his broke halfway. Earl had known he was dying when he wrote it. The handwriting was thin and shaky, not like the rest. It said, "To whoever gets her running again. If it's one of my boys, then I taught you right after all, and I'm proud, and quit crying, you look foolish. But I got a feeling it won't be. I got a feeling it'll be somebody smaller, somebody who ain't in a hurry, somebody who sits and listens. If that's you, Micah, and I think it is, then she was always meant for you. A machine ain't about the metal, it's about who loves it enough to learn her. You did. So she's yours now, boy. Take care of my brothers. They're rougher than they look and softer than they know. And when you ride her, I'll hear it wherever I am. Listen for me on the road." Nobody said a word. The room just went dead quiet, except for that engine idling low and warm like a heartbeat, like the old man himself was standing right there. Then Denny Callahan, the road captain who did not cry at two brothers' funerals or at his own wife's, the man made of knotted cable, sat right down on an overturned bucket and put his face in his grease-black hands and wept like a child. And once he went, they all went. Buck, the younger ones, big men with rockers on their backs and hard miles in their eyes, standing in a gravel lot at sundown, wiping their faces on their sleeves and not one of them ashamed. 3 summers of failing, and it turned out the old man had never left them at all. He'd just been waiting on somebody who'd slow down long enough to hear him. Vernon Pike quietly rolled his ramp back up. He never said a word about the check. He got in his truck and drove off down the mountain, and I like to think even he understood that some things aren't for sale, no matter how far behind the bank you are. Now, you're wondering about the money, the loan, the letter with the hard words, and here's how that went. Denny drove into town the next Monday with that story in his mouth, and it turned out a running 1948 Panhead with a history like Earl's, ridden by his own grandson, was worth more standing in that garage than it ever would have been on Vernon Pike's flatbed. Word got around Colville the way word does. People came to hear it run. The club started a Sunday morning shine-and ride, $1 to sit on the founder's bike, and folks paid it gladly and paid it twice. They made the loan. They made it with room to spare, and they never once had to sell the thing that saved them. They didn't let Micah ride it, of course. He was 8. But every Sunday, Denny would fire it up the way the boy taught them, gentle half-choke, a whisper of throttle, listen before you touch. And Micah would sit up on the tank in front of him with Diesel watching from the porch, and they'd roll slow around the lot with that thunder rolling off the hills, and every man in the Iron Wardens would go quiet and just listen. Because Earl said he'd hear it wherever he was. And when a sound like that comes rolling up a mountain at sundown, you don't much argue with a promise like that. The notebook has a place now, in a glass case on the clubhouse wall, open to the last page. Under it there's a little brass plate the men had made, and it doesn't say anything fancy. It just says the first thing Earl ever wrote in it, the thing that fixed everything, the thing those grown men had to learn from a child. Listen before you touch. Denny keeps a spare Woodruff key in his vest pocket now, carries it everywhere. When somebody asks him why, he'll pull it out, that little half-moon of steel the size of a thumbnail, and he'll turn it over in his fingers a while before he answers. And what he says is this. He says the whole time they thought that engine was dead, it was talking to them, firing once, banging like a gunshot, trying its best to tell them what was wrong. They just kept kicking it harder instead of stopping to hear it. And it took a quiet little boy on an overturned bucket, with a 3-legged dog and his grandpa's notebook, to do the one thing not a single grown man in that club had thought to do. He listened. And the old machine, and maybe the old man too, had been waiting on that all along.